The morning sun cast long shadows across the university campus as Camilla hurried toward her psychology class, clutching her worn leather diary against her chest. She had been writing in it since freshman year, documenting her deepest thoughts, fears, and dreams. What she didn't know was that her roommate Catherine had been watching her every move with growing jealousy and resentment. Catherine sat in the back row of the lecture hall, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the desk as she watched Camilla take her usual seat in the front. Everything about Camilla seemed to come so easily: her natural beauty, her genuine friendships, her effortless academic success. But what Catherine envied most was how Camilla seemed to navigate life with such authenticity and grace. While Catherine felt like she was constantly performing for others, the diary had become Catherine's obsession. She had noticed how Camilla would write in it every night, pouring her heart onto those pages with the same passion she brought to everything else. Catherine wondered what secrets lay hidden within those handwritten pages. What vulnerabilities Camilla kept locked away from the world that seemed to adore her after class. Camilla stopped by the campus coffee shop to meet her study group. She placed her diary on the table next to her textbooks, never imagining that Catherine was watching from across the room. When Camilla got up to order another latte, Catherine saw her opportunity. Her heart pounded as she approached the table, engaging Camilla's friends in casual conversation. While carefully sliding the diary into her bag, Camilla returned to find her friends laughing at something Catherine had said. She smiled warmly, always happy to see people getting along. But as she gathered her things to leave, a cold panic washed over her. Her diary was gone? She searched frantically through her bag, under the table, around her chair. But it was nowhere to be found. Catherine offered to help search, her voice dripping with false concern. She suggested that maybe Camilla had left it in her dorm room or dropped it somewhere on campus. As Camilla's eyes filled with tears at the thought of losing 2 years of her most private thoughts, Catherine felt a strange mixture of guilt and satisfaction. She had what she wanted, but seeing Camilla's genuine distress made her stomach twist uncomfortably. That evening, Catherine sat alone in her room with the diary in her hands. The leather cover was soft from years of handling, and she could smell the faint scent of Camilla's perfume on the pages. Her roommate was out searching the entire campus with their friends, retracing her steps from the past few days. Catherine knew she should return it, claimed she found it somewhere, but curiosity had taken hold of her completely. She opened to the first page and began to read. What she found surprised her. Instead of the perfect life she had imagined, Camilla's words revealed a young woman struggling with deep insecurities, family pressures, and the same fears that plagued everyone their age. There were entries about feeling overwhelmed by expectations, about missing her childhood home, about wondering if she was good enough for the scholarship that brought her to this prestigious university. As Catherine read deeper into the diary, she discovered that Camilla had been watching her too. There were entries where Camilla expressed admiration for Catherine's confidence, her ability to command attention in any room, her seemingly unshakable self-assurance. Camilla had written about wishing she could be more like Catherine, more bold and fearless in pursuing what she wanted. The irony wasn't lost on Catherine, but instead of bringing understanding, it fueled her resentment even more. If Camilla was struggling just like everyone else, then why did everything still seem to work out for her? Why did professors remember her name? Why did people gravitate toward her at parties? Why did opportunities seem to fall into her lap? Catherine convinced herself that Camilla was simply better at hiding her flaws, better at manipulating others into believing she was perfect. By the time Camilla returned to their dorm room that night, exhausted and heartbroken from her unsuccessful search, Catherine had read through months of entries. She pretended to be asleep as Camilla quietly got ready for bed, listening to her roommate's muffled sobs as she grieved the loss of something so precious and irreplaceable. Catherine lay awake long into the night, the diary hidden under her mattress, wrestling with what she had learned and what she planned to do with this newfound knowledge. She told herself that Camilla deserved to be brought down a few notches, that someone needed to show the world who she really was beneath that perfect facade. But deep down, Catherine knew her motivations were far more selfish and cruel. The next morning, Catherine watched as Camilla struggled to focus during their shared classes, her usual bright demeanor dimmed by the loss of her diary. When friends asked if she had found it yet, Camilla would force a smile and say she was sure it would turn up eventually, but Catherine could see the hope fading from her eyes with each passing hour. It was during their contemporary literature seminar that Catherine made her decision. Professor Williams had assigned oral presentations on personal narratives and their impact on understanding human nature. As students signed up for presentation slots, Catherine volunteered to go first, claiming she had discovered some fascinating material that would perfectly illustrate the assignment's themes. Camilla looked up with mild interest, still distracted by thoughts of her missing diary. She had no idea that her most private thoughts were about to become the subject of public scrutiny, or that the person she considered a friend was about to betray her in the most devastating way possible. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she wrote her name on the presentation schedule, but her smile remained perfectly composed as she began planning how she would reveal Camilla's secrets to the world. The following days passed in a haze of whispered conversations and pointed stares as the story of Catherine's presentation spread beyond their immediate academic circle. Camilla had moved into a temporary single room in another dormitory, but the physical distance couldn't shield her from the psychological aftermath of having her most private thoughts exposed to public scrutiny. She found herself unable to concentrate on her studies, constantly wondering who had heard the details of her diary entries and what they now thought of her. The university counseling center became Camilla's refuge during this difficult period. Dr. Sarah Chun, a gentle therapist with years of experience helping students through various crises, provided a safe space where Camilla could begin to process the complex emotions surrounding the betrayal. The sessions were painful but necessary, helping Camilla understand that her feelings of shame and violation were completely valid responses to what amounted to psychological assault by someone she had trusted. Catherine, meanwhile, was discovering that her actions had consequences she hadn't anticipated. The social isolation was becoming more pronounced each day, with former friends actively avoiding her and acquaintances treating her with obvious disdain. She had expected some negative reactions, but the depth and persistence of the community's disapproval surprised her. She began to realize that what she had done wasn't being viewed as a harmless prank or academic exercise, but as a serious breach of human decency. The administration became involved when several students filed formal complaints about Catherine's behavior. While reading someone's diary in a class presentation wasn't technically against any specific university policy, the deliberate cruelty and public humiliation aspects raised concerns about student welfare and campus climate. Dean Morrison called both Catherine and Camilla to separate meetings to discuss the situation and explore potential consequences or interventions. During her meeting with the dean, Catherine maintained her defensive stance, arguing that she had used the diary as legitimate source material for an academic assignment. She claimed that personal narratives were fair game for scholarly analysis and that she had never specifically identified Camilla as the author. However, her arguments fell flat when Dean Morrison pointed out that everyone in the class had obviously recognized the diary's owner and that Catherine's motivation appeared to be malicious rather than educational. Camilla's meeting with the dean was more supportive, focusing on resources available to help her recover from the incident and continue her education without further harassment. Dean Morrison assured her that the university took student welfare seriously and that they were exploring appropriate responses to Catherine's behavior. However, she also gently explained that proving intentional harm in an academic context was complex, and that any formal disciplinary action would need to follow due process. The most unexpected development came when Professor Williams decided to use the incident as a teaching moment for the entire class. He scheduled a special session on ethics and personal narrative research, inviting a guest speaker who specialized in privacy rights and psychological research. The presentation focused on consent, harm, and the responsibility researchers have to protect the dignity and welfare of their subjects, even in academic contexts. Catherine was required to attend this session, sitting uncomfortably as the guest speaker outlined various ethical frameworks that made clear how significantly her presentation had violated basic principles of human research. Several of her classmates shot pointed looks in her direction as the speaker discussed cases where researchers had caused psychological harm through their work and the professional consequences they had faced. The academic justification Catherine had clung to began to crumble as she realized the scholarly community would not view her actions favorably. Camilla chose not to attend the ethics session, but word of it reached her through Maya and other friends who remained supportive throughout the ordeal. She was grateful that the incident was being taken seriously and used constructively, but she was still struggling with the basic challenge of rebuilding her sense of safety and privacy. Every time she considered writing in a new journal, she found herself paralyzed by the fear that her thoughts might somehow be exposed again. The social dynamics on campus had shifted dramatically as students chose sides or simply tried to avoid getting involved in the controversy. Catherine found herself eating meals alone and walking to classes without companions, while Camilla was surrounded by friends who wanted to show their support but sometimes didn't know how to help. The attention, even when positive, felt overwhelming to someone who was still processing the violation of having her private thoughts made public. Marcus became Camilla's anchor during this turbulent period, helping her navigate the complex emotions and social pressures that followed the incident. He encouraged her to focus on her own healing rather than worrying about what others thought, and he helped her see that anyone who judged her based on the diary entries had revealed more about their own character than about hers. His steady support gave her the strength to continue attending classes and participating in campus life, even when it felt impossibly difficult. Catherine began receiving pressure from her own family when word of the incident reached them through social media posts and phone calls from concerned relatives. Her parents were appalled by her behavior and struggled to understand what could have motivated such cruelty toward someone who had been nothing but kind to their daughter. The disappointment in their voices during phone calls added another layer of consequence that Catherine hadn't anticipated when she planned her presentation. As weeks passed, Catherine started to experience what psychologists recognize as delayed guilt and remorse. The initial satisfaction and justification she had felt began to fade, replaced by a growing understanding of the genuine harm she had caused. She found herself lying awake at night remembering Camilla's devastated expression, the shocked silence of their classmates, and the growing isolation that resulted from her choices. For the first time, she began to truly comprehend that her actions had been driven by jealousy and resentment rather than any noble academic purpose. The diary still sat in Catherine's possession, hidden in her desk drawer like evidence of a crime she was still trying to deny. She knew she should return it, but approaching Camilla seemed impossible given the magnitude of her betrayal. Every time she looked at the leather cover, she was reminded of the trust she had violated and the friendship she had destroyed through her own cruelty and selfishness. Friends and family members began suggesting that Catherine needed to take concrete steps to address the harm she had caused. The idea of a genuine apology seemed both necessary and terrifying, requiring her to fully acknowledge the cruelty of her actions and the pain she had inflicted on someone who had never wronged her. The process of true accountability was proving to be far more challenging than the moment of betrayal had been. Camilla ran blindly through the hallways, her vision blurred by tears and the overwhelming need to escape the suffocating walls of the building, where her most private thoughts had just been exposed to public ridicule. Students she passed in the corridors stared at her obvious distress, but she was beyond caring about appearances now. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained for years had been shattered in a matter of minutes, and she felt completely raw and exposed. She found herself in the university's botanical garden, a quiet space behind the science building where she had often come to write in her diary during peaceful afternoons. The irony of seeking comfort in the very place where she had created the words that now tormented her wasn't lost on her, but she needed somewhere private to fall apart completely. She collapsed onto a stone bench beneath a flowering cherry tree and finally allowed herself to sob with the full force of her devastation back in the classroom. An uncomfortable silence had settled over the remaining students after Camilla's departure. Professor Williams cleared his throat and suggested they take a short break before the next presentation, his tone making it clear that he was deeply troubled by what had just occurred. Catherine remained at the front of the room, gathering her papers with hands that trembled slightly, despite her attempts to appear composed and satisfied with her performance. Several classmates approached Catherine with expressions ranging from confusion to outright disgust. Maya, one of Camilla's closest friends, confronted her directly. "That was Camilla's diary, wasn't it?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "How could you do something so cruel? She's been devastated about losing it, and you've had it this whole time?" Catherine deflected the accusations with claims about academic freedom and the importance of authentic source material. But her explanation sounded hollow even to her own ears. Word of the presentation spread quickly through the tight-knit campus community. By lunchtime, nearly everyone had heard some version of what had happened in Professor Williams' class. The reactions were mixed. Some students were fascinated by the drama and eager to know more details about what had been revealed, while others were appalled by what they saw as a profound violation of privacy and trust. The incident became the subject of heated debates about ethics, friendship, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Camilla's boyfriend, Marcus, found her still crying in the garden several hours later. He had heard about the presentation from mutual friends and immediately went searching for her, knowing she would need someone to help her process what had happened. When he found her, she was sitting in the same position she had collapsed into hours earlier, staring at nothing with red-rimmed eyes that held an emptiness he had never seen before. Marcus sat beside her without saying anything at first, simply offering his presence and warmth while she struggled to find words for her devastation. When she finally began to speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. She told him about the months of entries that Catherine had read, about the specific fears and insecurities that were now public knowledge, about the complete betrayal of trust by someone she had considered a friend. She felt like her entire identity had been stripped away, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in ways she had never experienced. The most painful part wasn't just the public humiliation, though that was certainly devastating. What hurt most was realizing that Catherine had been living alongside her for 2 years, observing her daily life and apparently harboring such deep resentment and cruelty. Camilla had genuinely cared about Catherine, had tried to be a good roommate and friend, had even admired qualities she saw in her. The betrayal cut so deeply because it came from someone she had trusted completely. Marcus held her while she cried, feeling helpless in the face of such calculated cruelty. He had never particularly liked Catherine, finding her somewhat superficial and self-centered, but he had never imagined she was capable of something so deliberately harmful. He struggled to understand what could have motivated such a vicious attack on someone who had never shown Catherine anything but kindness and friendship. Meanwhile, Catherine was beginning to experience the social consequences of her actions. The initial satisfaction she had felt during the presentation was rapidly being replaced by growing isolation, as more students learned what she had done. Even those who weren't particularly close to Camilla seemed disturbed by the breach of trust and privacy. Catherine found herself eating lunch alone, walking to classes without the usual friendly greetings from acquaintances, and facing cold stares from people who had previously been neutral toward her. Professor Williams requested a private meeting with Catherine that afternoon. In his office, surrounded by books on ethics and human psychology, he expressed his disappointment and concern about her presentation. While he acknowledged that she had technically fulfilled the assignment requirements, he made it clear that using someone's private diary without permission crossed serious ethical boundaries. He questioned whether she had considered the psychological impact on the diary's author and suggested she might benefit from counseling to explore what had motivated such harmful behavior. Catherine left the meeting, feeling defensive and misunderstood, convinced that people were overreacting to what she saw as a legitimate academic exercise. She told herself that Camilla needed to learn that being perfect wasn't sustainable, that everyone faced challenges, and that perhaps this experience would make her stronger and more authentic. But these justifications felt increasingly weak as she faced the growing social consequences of her actions, and the persistent image of Camilla's devastated face as she fled the classroom. That evening, Catherine returned to their shared dorm room to find that Camilla had moved out completely. All of her belongings were gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and a sense of emptiness that seemed to permeate the space. Catherine realized that she had not only lost a roommate but had also destroyed any possibility of redemption or reconciliation. The diary sat on her desk where she had left it that morning, and now it seemed less like a trophy and more like evidence of her own capacity for cruelty. She opened the diary one more time, this time reading entries she had skipped over in her search for ammunition. She found passages where Camilla had written about feeling grateful for their friendship, about hoping Catherine was happy, about wondering if she was being a good roommate. The kindness and genuine care in these entries made Catherine's stomach twist with an emotion she was reluctant to identify as guilt. As night fell and the campus grew quiet, Catherine finally began to understand the true magnitude of what she had done. She had not just exposed Camilla's secrets. She had shattered a person's sense of safety and trust in ways that might take years to repair. For the first time since stealing the diary, Catherine allowed herself to imagine how she would feel if someone had done the same thing to her, and the thought made her physically ill with recognition of her own cruelty. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation for Catherine as she carefully selected which entries from Camilla's diary would have the most devastating impact. She had decided to frame her presentation as an analysis of authentic personal writing, claiming she had found an anonymous diary that perfectly demonstrated the disconnect between public persona and private reality. She spent hours practicing her delivery, ensuring she could read Camilla's most vulnerable moments with the perfect balance of academic detachment and dramatic flair. Meanwhile, Camilla had grown increasingly withdrawn. Her friends noticed the change immediately. The girl who once lit up every room now seemed to move through her days like a ghost. She had stopped participating in class discussions, barely touched her food at meals, and spent most of her time staring out windows with a distant, melancholy expression. The diary had been her safe space, her way of processing the complex emotions of growing up, and without it, she felt completely untethered. Catherine observed these changes with a mixture of satisfaction and unexpected guilt. She had wanted to see Camilla brought low, but watching her roommate's genuine suffering was more difficult than she had anticipated. Still, she pushed forward with her plan, convincing herself that Camilla needed to learn that actions had consequences, that being perfect wasn't sustainable, and that everyone deserved to face some real hardship. Monday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill, and students filed into Professor Williams' classroom with their usual mix of sleepy reluctance and caffeinated energy. Camilla took her seat near the window, while Catherine positioned herself at the front of the room with a small stack of papers and a confident smile. She had typed out selected passages from the diary, organizing them thematically to create maximum emotional impact. Professor Williams introduced the day's presentations with his usual enthusiasm about personal narratives and their power to illuminate universal human experiences. Catherine stood up gracefully, her polished appearance and self-assured manner immediately commanding attention. She began her presentation by discussing the theoretical framework of private writing, how diaries and journals served as windows into authentic human psychology rather than the carefully constructed identities people presented to the world. Camilla listened with mild interest at first, appreciating Catherine's articulate analysis of personal narrative theory. She had no reason to suspect what was coming, no warning that her most private thoughts were about to be dissected in front of 30 of her peers and professor. Catherine's voice was smooth and professional as she transitioned into what she claimed was a case study of an anonymous diary she had discovered. The first passage, Catherine Reed, was relatively benign. Thoughts about the pressure of maintaining good grades and the fear of disappointing parents who had sacrificed so much for their daughter's education. Camilla felt a strange chill of recognition, but told herself that these were universal concerns that could apply to any student. Surely it was just coincidence that the words sounded so familiar, so perfectly aligned with her own thoughts and fears. But as Catherine continued reading, the passages became more specific, more unmistakably personal. She read about homesickness so intense it felt like physical pain, about crying alone in the shower so roommates wouldn't hear, about feeling like an imposter among classmates who seemed to belong at the university in ways she never would. Camilla's hands began to shake as she recognized not just the sentiment but the exact words she had written in purple ink during her first semester. Catherine's voice took on a subtle mocking tone as she read an entry about social anxiety, about practicing conversations in the mirror before parties, about the exhausting effort required to appear confident and outgoing when every social interaction felt like a performance. She paused dramatically between passages, allowing the class to absorb the contrast between the polished exterior most people projected and the messy reality of inner emotional life. The recognition hit Camilla like a physical blow. These weren't just similar thoughts. These were her exact words, her specific experiences, her most vulnerable confessions. Her face drained of color as she realized that Catherine had not only found her diary, but was systematically exposing every insecurity and fear she had ever committed to paper. The betrayal was so complete, so unexpected, that for a moment she couldn't even process what was happening. Catherine continued relentlessly, reading about Camilla's struggles with body image, her fears about her relationship with her boyfriend Marcus, her concerns about whether her scholarship meant she was taking someone else's rightful place at the university. Each word felt like a scalpel, precisely cutting away the protective layers Camilla had carefully constructed around her vulnerabilities. The girl who had seemed so perfect, so effortlessly successful, was being systematically dissected in front of an audience of her peers. Students in the classroom began to shift uncomfortably as the presentation took on an increasingly invasive quality. While Catherine maintained her academic tone, there was something cruel about the way she lingered over particularly painful passages, something voyeuristic about the entire exercise that made many listeners feel complicit in something they couldn't quite name. Professor Williams frowned slightly, sensing that the presentation had veered into territory that felt less like scholarship and more like public humiliation. Camilla sat frozen in her chair, unable to move or speak or even breathe properly. She watched Catherine's face for any sign of remorse, any indication that this was some kind of terrible mistake, but found only cold satisfaction barely concealed beneath a veneer of academic objectivity. The person she had considered a friend, someone she had lived with for 2 years, was systematically destroying her with her own words. The most devastating moment came when Catherine read a recent entry about feeling grateful for Catherine's friendship, about admiring her roommate's confidence and wondering if she would ever feel so comfortable in her own skin. The irony was so brutal, so perfectly calculated to maximize humiliation, that several students in the class audibly gasped. Camilla had written those words just days before the diary disappeared, never imagining that her gratitude and admiration would be weaponized against her in the most public way possible. As Catherine neared the end of her presentation, summarizing her analysis of how private writing revealed the universal human tendency toward self-doubt and emotional complexity, Camilla finally found the strength to move. She stood up on shaking legs, grabbed her bag, and walked toward the door with as much dignity as she could muster. Every eye in the room followed her movement, but she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to let them see the tears that had finally begun to fall. Catherine watched her leave with an expression that might have been satisfaction or regret. Even she wasn't entirely sure which emotion was stronger. She had achieved exactly what she set out to do, but the victory felt strangely hollow as she concluded her presentation to a classroom full of uncomfortable silence and Professor Williams' distinctly disapproving stare. 3 weeks after the devastating presentation, Catherine found herself facing the harsh reality of complete social isolation. The campus that had once felt welcoming and full of opportunities now seemed hostile and unwelcoming. Former friends crossed streets to avoid her. Study groups disbanded when she approached, and even professors treated her with noticeable coolness. The consequences of her actions had created a prison of her own making, and for the first time, she began to understand the true weight of what she had done. The breaking point came during a particularly lonely evening when Catherine overheard a group of students discussing plans for an upcoming charity fundraiser that Camilla had organized before the incident. They were debating whether to cancel the event because Camilla was still too emotionally fragile to handle the leadership responsibilities, and they were struggling to find someone else with her organizational skills and genuine passion for the cause. Catherine realized that her cruelty hadn't just harmed Camilla personally. It had rippled out to affect an entire charitable initiative that would have benefited dozens of local families. That night, Catherine finally forced herself to confront the full scope of her actions. She sat down with a piece of paper and began listing every aspect of harm she had caused: the violation of privacy, the destruction of trust, the public humiliation, the disruption of Camilla's academic progress, the damage to her mental health, and the broader impact on campus climate. The list was longer than she had expected, and seeing it all written out made the magnitude of her cruelty undeniable. Dr. Chun, the counselor who had been helping Camilla, also began working with Catherine after Dean Morrison suggested that understanding Catherine's motivations might help prevent similar incidents in the future. During their first session, Catherine struggled to articulate why she had targeted Camilla with such calculated cruelty. The jealousy and resentment she had felt seemed petty and inadequate as explanations for such devastating behavior, but they were the only honest answers she could provide. The therapy sessions forced Catherine to examine her own insecurities and the ways she had projected her self-doubt onto Camilla. She began to understand that her perception of Camilla as perfect had been a product of her own feelings of inadequacy, rather than an accurate assessment of reality. The diary entry she had read revealed that Camilla struggled with many of the same doubts and fears that plagued Catherine, but instead of finding comfort in this shared humanity, Catherine had felt angry that Camilla seemed to navigate these challenges more gracefully. Meanwhile, Camilla was slowly beginning to rebuild her sense of self with the help of her support network and continued counseling. She had started writing again, though now she kept her journal locked in a secure drawer and found herself second-guessing every private thought. The healing process was complicated by the fact that she still had to exist in the same campus environment where her most vulnerable moments had been exposed, but she was gradually learning to distinguish between her own shame and the inappropriate actions of someone else. The turning point in Catherine's journey toward accountability came when she encountered Camilla's younger sister Emma, who was visiting campus for a prospective student weekend. Emma didn't recognize Catherine initially, but when she mentioned that she was looking for Camilla, Catherine realized she was speaking to someone who loved and admired the person she had so callously attacked. The conversation was brief, but Emma's genuine concern for her sister's well-being and her obvious pride in Camilla's accomplishments made Catherine see her victim as a real person with a family who cared deeply about her. That encounter motivated Catherine to finally take concrete action. She wrote a detailed letter to Camilla, acknowledging the full scope of her wrongdoing without making excuses or seeking forgiveness. The letter was painful to write because it required her to admit that her actions had been motivated by jealousy and selfishness, rather than any principled stance or academic purpose. She also announced her intention to withdraw from several shared classes, to give Camilla space to complete her education without constant reminders of the betrayal. Catherine also approached Dean Morrison about facing formal consequences for her actions. While the university's disciplinary process was complex, she requested that her behavior be officially documented and that she be required to complete educational programs about ethics, empathy, and the psychological impact of cyberbullying and privacy violations. She wanted there to be a formal record of what she had done. partly as accountability and partly as protection for future potential victims. The letter to Camilla was delivered through Dr. Chun, who served as an intermediary to ensure that Camilla could choose whether or not to read it without pressure. Camilla ultimately decided to read the letter with Marcus and Dr. Chun present for support, and while the apology was more comprehensive than she had expected, it couldn't undo the harm that had been done. The letter did provide some closure by confirming that the attack had been motivated by Catherine's own issues rather than anything Camilla had done wrong. Catherine also made the difficult decision to return the diary through the same intermediary system. She had considered keeping it as some kind of twisted memento, but ultimately recognized that holding on to it represented a continued violation of Camilla's privacy. When Camilla finally held her diary again, weeks after it had been stolen, the leather cover felt different. In her hands, like an object that had been contaminated by its journey through someone else's malicious intentions. The campus community watched these developments with interest and varying degrees of satisfaction. Some felt that Catherine's acknowledgement of wrongdoing was too little, too late, while others appreciated that she was at least taking responsibility for her actions rather than continuing to justify them. The incident had sparked broader conversations about privacy, consent, and the ways that social, media, and academic culture could be weaponized to cause psychological harm. Professor Williams used the entire incident as the foundation for a new course module on research ethics that would be mandatory for all students in his program. He recognized that while Catherine's behavior was extreme, the underlying issues of consent, privacy, and the potential for academic work to cause real harm were relevant to many fields of study. The incident had provided a stark, real-world example of why ethical frameworks existed and what could happen when they were ignored. As the semester drew to a close, both Catherine and Camilla were preparing for different futures. Catherine had decided to transfer to another university, recognizing that her actions had made her continued presence on campus harmful to Camilla's healing and to the broader community climate. The decision was partly voluntary and partly encouraged by the administration, but it represented Catherine's first genuine attempt to prioritize someone else's well-being over her own convenience. Camilla, supported by friends, family, and professional counseling, was planning to continue her education at the same university. She had worked hard to rebuild her confidence and sense of safety, and she refused to let Catherine's cruelty derail her academic and personal goals. The experience had changed her in some fundamental ways, making her more cautious about trust but also more appreciative of the genuine relationships in her life. 6 months after the incident, Camilla stood in the same lecture hall where her privacy had been so brutally violated, but now she was the one giving a presentation. She had chosen to speak about resilience and recovery in the aftermath of betrayal trauma, turning her painful experience into a source of education and advocacy for others who had faced similar violations. Her voice was steady as she discussed the psychological impact of having one's private thoughts weaponized by someone they trusted. And several students in the audience wiped away tears as she described her journey toward healing. The presentation was part of Camilla's senior thesis project, which had evolved to focus on privacy rights, consent, and the ethical responsibilities of academic researchers. Working closely with Dr. Chun and Professor Williams, she had developed a comprehensive framework for understanding and preventing the kind of harm that Catherine had inflicted. Her work was gaining attention beyond the university, with several psychology journals expressing interest in publishing her research on betrayal trauma in academic settings. Catherine, now attending a different university across the country, watched Camilla's presentation via live stream. She had been following Camilla's recovery and advocacy work from a distance, partly out of genuine concern and partly because she was still processing her own guilt and responsibility. Seeing Camilla transform her pain into meaningful work that could help others was both inspiring and deeply humbling for Catherine, who was still struggling with the consequences of her own choices. The transfer to a new university had been challenging for Catherine in ways she hadn't anticipated. Starting over socially and academically while carrying the weight of what she had done required a level of emotional work she had never experienced before. She had continued therapy throughout the transition, slowly learning to understand the deeper insecurities and character flaws that had led her to such cruel behavior. The process was uncomfortable and often painful, but it was necessary for any hope of genuine change. At her new school, Catherine had chosen not to share the details of why she had transferred, but she approached relationships and academic work with a caution and humility that was entirely new for her. She found herself drawn to volunteer work with organizations that supported victims of cyberbullying and privacy violations, though she was careful not to center her own experience in these efforts. The work was her attempt to channel her guilt into something constructive, though she recognized that no amount of volunteer service could undo the specific harm she had caused Camilla. Meanwhile, the original incident had led to significant policy changes at Camilla's university. The administration had developed new guidelines for student presentations that required explicit consent when using personal narratives or private documents as source material. Professor Williams had worked with the Ethics Committee to create training modules that all students in research-oriented programs were now required to complete before being allowed to work with human subjects or personal data. Dr. Chun had used the case as the foundation for a research study on betrayal trauma in academic settings. With Camilla's permission and collaboration, their work together had identified several factors that made academic environments particularly vulnerable to privacy violations, including the competitive pressure between students, the emphasis on finding novel source material, and the power dynamics inherent in classroom presentations. The study was contributing to a broader understanding of how trust violations could be prevented and addressed in educational contexts. Camilla's relationship with Marcus had deepened through the crisis. As they had navigated the challenges of recovery and healing together, he had been a steady source of support throughout her darkest moments, and their bond had been strengthened by facing such a significant challenge as a team. They were making plans for graduate school, with both of them interested in pursuing careers that would allow them to advocate for privacy rights and support trauma survivors. The charity fundraiser that had nearly been canceled due to Camilla's initial inability to lead it had eventually been reorganized and executed successfully under her direction. The event had raised more money than originally projected, partly because the campus community had rallied around Camilla and the cause after learning about what she had endured. The success of the fundraiser had been an important milestone in Camilla's recovery, proving to herself that she could still accomplish meaningful work despite the violations she had experienced. Catherine's parents had eventually visited her at the new university, and their conversations about the incident had been some of the most difficult of her life. They struggled to understand how their daughter had become capable of such cruelty, and Catherine found herself unable to provide explanations that felt adequate even to herself. The disappointment in their voices was harder to bear than any formal punishment could have been, and it motivated her continued work in therapy and self-improvement. As Camilla's presentation concluded, the audience responded with sustained applause that seemed to acknowledge both the quality of her academic work and the courage it had taken to transform such a painful experience into meaningful research. Several students approached her afterward with questions about her research and requests for guidance on their own projects related to privacy and consent. The interaction reinforced Camilla's decision to pursue graduate studies in this area, where she could continue advocating for protections against the kind of violations she had experienced. The diary that had been at the center of the entire incident sat locked in Camilla's desk drawer, but she no longer wrote in it regularly. Instead, she had started a new journal with different purposes, focusing on gratitude, goal setting, and processing positive experiences rather than working through fears and insecurities. The shift in her writing practice reflected broader changes in how she approached vulnerability and trust, with a greater emphasis on protecting her emotional well-being while still remaining open to meaningful connections. In her final therapy session before graduating, Camilla reflected on the unexpected ways that Catherine's betrayal had ultimately led to positive changes in her life. While she would never minimize the pain and violation she had experienced, she recognized that the incident had taught her important lessons about resilience, the value of genuine relationships, and her own capacity for recovery and growth. She had discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed and had found a career path that felt deeply meaningful and personally fulfilling. Catherine, watching the live stream end, closed her laptop and sat in the quiet of her dorm room, processing the mixed emotions that always arose when she encountered evidence of Camilla's continued success and healing. She felt genuine happiness for Camilla's recovery and pride in her former victim's transformation of trauma into advocacy. But she also felt the persistent weight of knowing that her own cruelty had been the catalyst for that pain. Regardless of how constructively Camilla had channeled it, the incident had changed both of their lives in fundamental ways, though the changes had been vastly different in nature and consequence. For Camilla, it had been a devastating violation that ultimately led to greater self-awareness, meaningful work, and deeper relationships. For Catherine, it had been a moment of cruelty that forced her to confront her own capacity for harm and begin the long process of becoming a better person. Neither of them would ever be the same, but both had found ways to move forward with greater wisdom and understanding than they had possessed before their paths crossed in such a destructive way.